All right, we're gonna just get started as we figure out some tech stuff. I think we're trying to get the ASL going. I just wanted to, I'll introduce myself. My name is Meena Jagannath, and I am the Director of Global Programs at Movement Law Lab. Basically today, this is the Internationalism Political Education session. We thought that since there's so much brilliance also in the audience here, that we would not just do a panel format, but actually after, sort of setting some foundation, that it would be great to actually get all of you involved in the conversation. So the first 45 minutes or so, if we can keep ourselves to time, will be panel format, and then we're going to do a fishbowl. And we'll explain a little bit more what a fishbowl is, but essentially it's a way for, you all to both ask and answer questions on the subject. So we are excited to have this time with you, and we'll see how it goes.
And to click whatever. Right. Good morning. How y'all doing? Thank you so much for being here. This really is, as Meena said, a group of people that we were really eager to convene. So as we were thinking about who's going to be in this room, if folks are familiar with emergent strategy, it's about who's here. Trusting who's here and that we have everything that we need. And when we were thinking about this panel, we were thinking of you and the opportunity that we had to get together and to really take at least a moment to breathe, to strategize, to exchange, to learn from one another, and to introduce each other. I think part of what we need as we move forward is the relationships that are already forming, the relationships that are in this room, particularly as we think about internationalism. My name is Nadia Ben Youssef. I'm the Director of Advocacy at the Center for Constitutional Rights. I use she and her pronouns. And before we start, and I'll have the panelists introduce themselves, I just want us to take a moment and ground ourselves in what is the theme largely of this panel, which is that we are in the business of world making. We called it unfinished business. You said that this morning. Robin D.G. Kelly said it this morning. It's unfinished business of liberation, the unfinished business of struggle, the unfinished business of building the world that we need and deserve. And when we say it's unfinished, it means it has already started. It has already started. And so before we begin, I just invite you to close your eyes and think about the teachers in your life. Those are your ancestors. Those are the people who have guided you, the artists that have awoken your imagination to end up right here, that told you that the world could be radically different than it is right now, that inspired you to fight for that world, to bring your ancestors into the room, to bring your teachers into the room. They have passed the baton. They have passed the baton to you. You're part of this business of world making. And to yourself or into the room, if you feel so inclined, can you name those teachers? They are guiding you. They are guiding us. Bring them with you as you start strategizing, thinking. We have everything that we need. Before we begin this panel, I'm going to tell a quick story about a moment of world making that has inspired me, the ancestor that I am bringing into this room, and then I will ask each of you to do the same as panelists, and then we'll begin the conversation. How many of you are familiar with the story of and the moment of international convening called the Bandung Conference? A few. The Bandung Conference of April of 1955 was a gathering of 29 newly independent countries and some still colonized countries that came together in Indonesia to indict empire and to imagine a new world. There's incredible writing about that moment, and I think President of Indonesia, Sukarno, said it was a hurricane of national awakening and reawakening that has swept over this land, shaking it, changing it for the better. They were talking about anti-colonial struggles that were succeeding, the shaking off of empires and colonizers. When Malcolm X was reflecting on this time, he called it a tidal wave of color. In Bandung, 2/3 of the world were represented. Coming together, Asia, Africa, saying, we demand a new world. It was a critical moment for those of us who are committed to a global anti-colonial struggle. And my grandfather was the head of the North African delegation, representing Tunisia, Morocco, and Algeria. And this Bandung conference was a turning point in our family story, but also I think a turning point in our collective struggle, because this was a moment where the multitude gathered and said, we have to reimagine an economic world order. We have to increase solidarity and cooperation. We have what we need. We have what we need to make the world we deserve. And at the time that this was happening in Bandung, so revolutionaries were gathering, another thread was happening in history, which is that in Paris, so in the metropole, a neo-colonial leader of Tunisia named Habib Bourguiba was meeting with France to sign accords of self-autonomy of Tunisia with France, saying, we will maintain relationship with the colonizer, you will have power over our economic order, settlers will have access to courts. There was a lot of negotiation of what incremental independence would mean. So that was happening at the same time in April of 1955. And in Bandung, there was an uproar because this was the start of neo-colonial takeover of this next stage of world making. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about neo-colonialism as it persists. We're going to talk about how it shapeshifts. We're going to talk about Puerto Rico. We're going to talk about Palestine. And we're going to ask ourselves those questions. How did this unfinished business of world making get off track? When my grandfather, one of the only pieces of writing that we have in English came from Bandung, where he said, this is a fake autonomy. We reject the agreement that the Tunisian head of this new neo-colonial government has made with France. And it started a course of his life of militant uprising in Tunisia, trying to fight back against neo-colonialism. Our family was exiled into Egypt. We were political refugees until the late 80s, but my grandfather, who continued to struggle and continued to say, this is not the world we deserve. We've gotten off track in the business of world making. If we accept neo-colonial powers coming and instituting what Mina is going to talk about a bit more about international institutions that just establish and reinforce the status quo of hierarchy. And in August of 1961, as my grandfather was fighting and struggling and also building power in this same way, he was assassinated in Frankfurt, Germany by Habib Bourguiba because he believed that the world needed to be radically different. And that was such a threat. And it remains a threat. And part of the reason that we are so grateful that you all are here is because the way we will overcome that threat is in solidarity. Internationalism, requires solidarity. If we're serious about world making, we must do it together and in community. And so with that, there's so much to say, and we'll talk about Bandung later, but I would invite you each, if you can, to introduce yourselves. Maybe we'll go in your, and then we'll come back to Tenji. Mina, I think, already introduced herself, but you can say if you're interested, Mina. So the prompt is the ancestor, the teacher. Hello.
Uno, dos. Hi. All right. So hello. I'm very humbled to be here. My name is Maria de Lourdes Baello Calderon. People affectionately call me Mari Luli, or Maria, whatever. It's fine. I'm coming in from San Juan, Puerto Rico, and the ancestor that I'm bringing to this place, to this space, is my grandfather, Álvaro Calderón. He passed away in 2020, and he is a huge figure in my political upbringing. He was an independentista, someone who fought for the independence of Puerto Rico, who was incarcerated a number of times and for his political convictions. And I take him with me in every one of these events, and everywhere I pretty much go. So that's the ancestor I'm bringing in today.
Thank you, Maria. Hi, I'm Sandra Tamari. I go by she, her. I'm based here in St. Louis, so welcome everyone. I'm thinking of someone who, doesn't get a lot of press. She's usually a footnote in history, an organizer with SNCC in the 60s, Ethel Minor. She's someone that I've learned about recently. She was a newsletter editor for SNCC. And in 1967, after Israel occupied more Palestinian land in the West Bank and Gaza and Sinai, she put out a newsletter just asking questions about Palestine. It was really supposed to be an internal document for SNCC to try to do some political education and try to get the organization to take a political stance. But it got released, and Ethel came under lots of fire, but she stood strong and continued to ask those questions. And so I just think about the role of people asking the right questions and how important that is. So let's continue to try to formulate those questions together.
Hey y'all, I'm Tenji, she, her, from the Bronx, live in Brooklyn on Lenape land. And yes, I'm an organizer. I think that was a prompt. The person I always think of is my grandmother, my great grandmother, Rosina Gordon. She was my first teacher. She taught me a lot of things. She was the person who taught me about Black power and the power of Black women without saying Black power. And I always say my first classroom was her kitchen.
The person that I'm bringing into the room is my grandmother. It's also my teacher, who represents the quiet, fierce strength of women who drive the family, who drive the sort of the dreams of the family. She, for me, was a figure that represented, a power that is that is humble and yet fierce, and she is someone who I think represents to me the idea of solidarity.
Who thought about their grandparents? May their memories be a blessing. So we're going to dive in, I think, to part of what we hope to do in this particular panel, and then we'll get more into it in the fishbowl, is to really start understanding how some of these systems are continuing to operate. So colonialism, white supremacy in various contexts, how the system adapts to reform. So if our demands aren't transformational, then how the system can give us a little bit of what we're asking for and then still entrench the status quo, right? So we're going to talk about that in the context of Palestine, Puerto Rico, and then think about why internationalism gives us a way out. What does it unlock in terms of possibilities, and why it's such a critical value as we think of ourselves as movement lawyers, as movements, to incorporate and to embed. And then as we get into a fishbowl, we're going to talk about threats, material threats that you're seeing and global threats, and then exchange a few of the strategies, moments of victory and of success that we can build upon, both in our own lifetimes and those that we're bringing from history. So, Sandra, is it possible to start with you? In part because I think, one of what came up actually as we were thinking about internationalism for the conference, there was a real interest in Palestine. You heard Robin D.G. Kelly talk about it. For those who've been kind of following also a resurgence since Ferguson about the connections of Black Palestinian solidarity, there's a lot of talk in our movement about what we learn from each other. And so I think for you, Sandra, I'm interested, as you think about the history of colonization of Palestine, how those structures have embedded themselves. And then we'll get into a little bit more about resistance, but I think right now it's like the reflections on colonization, white supremacy or domination, the hierarchy of human life, how that continues to manifest itself in the Palestinian struggle.
All right, we'll try in a few minutes to get all of that in. As you know, Biden is in Palestine today. He declared he was a Zionist as soon as he touched down. He said, you don't need to be a Jew to be a Zionist. And we were like, yes, amen, that is true. Thank you for teaching the world. But something that he said in 2013 has been ringing in my mind. He said, if there were not an Israel, we would have to create it because it defends our interest, right? And that's the whole crux of this, right? That the US and Israel mirror one another, that Israel is our, colonial entity, right, in the region that has its tentacles in so many places, right? Surveillance, NSO, we've been hearing the stories, militarization. Palestinians are the testing ground, right, for weapons. Why is that, right? Both countries, the US and Israel, are settler colonial countries. Embedded from their very origins is the idea that you must eliminate the native, right? In their constitutions, in their citizenship laws, and who is included, who is excluded. Palestinians were never meant to be part of the picture. Just 2 days ago, the head of the World Jewish Congress, Lauder is his last name, published an op-ed in the Washington Post. And in any other context, everyone would be like, my God, what racism, what Nazism being published. But he made an argument about the pressing demographic threat, the growing numbers of Palestinians that are in the land from the river to the sea. This is the existential threat of the Palestinians to Zionism, to the colonial project of Israel. That if we, as Palestinians, were to take rights, whether that be through a decolonial process or even through the very idea of equality, that we are a threat to the Jewish state. Jewish state set up with the contradictions of trying to be Jewish and democratic. How can you be a democratic country when you're founded on the elimination of hundreds of thousands of people, right? That the Nakba, the events of 1948 that continue to this day, that continue to eliminate the demographic threat, right? Gaza is the perfect epitome of this. Gaza, an enclave smaller than the city of St. Louis, 2.2 million Palestinians caged, under complete siege for the last 15 years, simply because their return to their ancestral lands, many of whom are from villages and towns that are miles away. If you get on the rooftops of homes in Gaza, you can see these villages. Their return to those villages is a threat to the state, because you can't maintain supremacy unless you have the numbers. You insist upon the exclusion of people, and you maintain that one group of people is better than the other. Joe Biden was saying it very clearly for us in 2013, and he said it many times in these last couple of days. We in this country spend, as you all know, so much money locally on policing. We spend about the same percentage, about 50% of discretionary spending on weapons and defense and militarism. These are the priorities of this country, right? To contain those of us who are unwanted. And I think that we have to be thinking about the hard questions of what it takes to not reform, but to think about what lessons do Palestine, Puerto Rico, and other colonized places teach us about how abolition is not only about policing, not only about prisons, but about the entire system, right? We know this. The Constitution doesn't serve us. The courts do not serve us. You know, in Israel, it's the Supreme Court. It's, you know, half of the Supreme Court justices are settlers from West Bank settlements. And they're the ones that are making decisions about whether Mustafa Yatta in the West Bank should be destroyed or not destroyed. This is not an institution that's going to serve us. So abolition has to mean a dismantling of all of these systems entirely. There's no reform, and Palestinians have known this from day one. So how do we learn these lessons? How do we transform our visions of freedom into a new world?
Thanks, Sandra. So I think that two things come up: decolonization as the demand of Palestinians. It's decolonization as the demand, as the remedy to the harm. How can we imagine a completely reversed world order? And if we don't imagine that, again, the system will give us what we ask for because it's nimble. The status quo preserves itself through military force, through violence, but it also preserves itself through this facade of legitimacy, right? That we, you know, Sandra's talking about the establishment of the State of Israel at a time when this conversation was happening. An anti-colonial struggle was sweeping the world. You had now new institutions that you'll talk about too. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was written in 1948, which is the date of the Nakba. And so the system adapted to that reality and saying, okay, well, if you're talking about democracy, if you're talking about human rights, we're going to say that this state, which is a settler colonial state, is a democratic one. And we'll use the language of human rights, if that's what you want us to do, to try to preserve the status quo of exclusion, of elimination, of hierarchy. So we're going to flip it a little bit, Maria, to talk about from the freedom struggle side, like what are the steps that have been taken in the independence, the decolonization movement in Puerto Rico, and what are the forces that are also kind of pushing back on that vision of liberation?
I have like 5 minutes to talk on a very dense and very violent political history. And I have some notes here. And as a speaker of English as a second language, you're gonna find me like reading a lot of this, but only because like I wrote down my pointers. So, but yeah, thank you for that. So before we get into like the current forces that are pushing for like that, the colonizing forces that are still very much present in Puerto Rico as they were in 1898, right after the U.S. invasion of the island. I want to talk a little bit about the political history because it is imperative that we do that. So the fight for independence of Puerto Rico, as you know, as I said before, it's very violent and has is plagued with different examples of oppression. The government dedicated millions in resources to placate any indication of growing nationalism. It was literally illegal to show a Puerto Rican flag for decades. Anyone who would do that went immediately to jail. And the reason why I mentioned nationalism is because it's very important to mention this. Nationalism has a very different meaning to a US colony than it does here, right? So we need to talk about nationalism and what it means for Puerto Ricans. Because when we talk about Puerto Rico, we have to part from the premise and the historical fact that we are talking about a current US colony, very much existing today with 3.4 million of people that are still living on the islands of Puerto Rico because it's an archipelago, right? So it was a colony back in 1898 when the US invaded the island. It was in the first half of the 20th century when children were forced to drop their native languages overnight, to adopt a US imposed curriculum that was solely in English. But then because they couldn't meet the US's yearly marks, they were considered, the Puerto Rican children considered and this is like historical, this is completely recorded, the stupidest people in the US, right? Because we couldn't adopt to a new language overnight. It is when we had to acclimate and learn US history in high school, learn the language, the Pledge of Allegiance, right? All the national anthem. But, many in this country don't even know where Puerto Rico is. Puerto Rico is a headline when a hurricane hits or when tragedy strikes. And we need to talk about that as well and how disasters have shaped this country's idea of what Puerto Rico should look like and what democracy and equity and equality should look like for Puerto Ricans, always based on the US's idea of what that can be manifested, not on what Puerto Ricans want, right? And it is when a third of Puerto Rican women were submitted to a national US-funded experimental agenda on perfecting contraception, right? Thus leading to a third of Puerto Rican women being sterilized without their knowledge. That happened as well. And it is still today, right? When Silicon Valley tycoons are coming in and they're buying property en masse and they're developing short-term rental complexes and they're literally driving people out of their homes, leaving thousands homeless today. This is happening right now, right? And that is like the housing crisis, which is like the area that I work with, but is something that's happening worldwide, but it's happening in Puerto Rico too, because people want a piece of their tropical paradise, right? When in reality, we have all of these people that are living 40% of people in Puerto Rico live under the poverty line of the United States, right? I'm trying to, but the thing about the housing crisis now and that how colonialism is manifesting through it is that no one can really challenge it because it's all like just up to the market, right? And the market is not a tangible thing. And when the government just excuses and just says that there is nothing they can do because the market fluctuates and we can't control that, then that is alone, that in of itself is just a very clear way on how colonialism is just today, right? And how it manifests today is not a tangible thing because, it's up to the market and we can't touch that. So we were talking yesterday about political clarity, but I have to say that Puerto Ricans have that. We've had that for decades. We've been developing political clarity for decades, if not over a century. And we have been organizing for a long time. We kicked out a governor in 2019 who disrespected the people who died after Hurricane Maria and Hurricane Irma, right? And because Puerto Rico, it has never really been a debate. And I have to talk after Hurricane Maria, I remember that I feel like there are so many open wounds from Hurricane Maria that are very much alive still today. It's because in Puerto Rico, it has never really been a debate about Republicans versus Democrats, right? It has always been a debate about life or death, because our current political and economic infrastructure with the United States is literally killing people. It's killing us, right? It killed thousands of us when the US government halted aid to the islands because Puerto Ricans apparently are inherently corrupt and the government shouldn't be trusted. And that is one of the many ways that we still see, right, how we are treated, how we are economically and politically treated. So yeah, power is our ability, right? We were, I think it was Anjua, that you were saying before, that power is the ability to be self-determined and self-governed. And for centuries, right, we've been saying that before Congress, that we define what equality and equity looks like for Puerto Ricans and not the US government. Again, we're not just a headline when hurricane or when tragedy strikes. So when I'm asked about how those discourse limit the imagination of what's possible, I think of honestly, the Latino caucus even. I think about Congress and how they're trying to determine and they're trying to assess how Puerto Ricans, there's right now a bill before Congress that is trying to impose basically like the real referendum that basically it's up to the Congress say if Puerto Rican is going to eventually become an independent country or if it's going to become a state, or what is the political connection that benefits them more than anyone else. But supposedly it's going to be like the one binding agreement. But again, this is being decided in Congress. This is not being decided in Puerto Rico. This is not taking into account what we want, what our stance is, and the very troublesome political history behind it, right? So I think that I'm leaving it with that. Well, I'm gonna say one last thing, and I know I'm running out of time, but and I do believe, I very strongly believe that the US suffers a chronic confusion about its history as an empire. One of the fantasies of the United States since its founding is that it's a republic and it differentiated itself from empire. But the reality is that from its independence, it was an empire of sorts, meaning that it had states and territories and had a differentiated political space in the way that empires do. It's been a myth, a persistent one, that the US is uniquely virtuous on the political stage among other great powers because it refuses to engage in the meaning of empire. So when we were talking yesterday about political clarity, I think that something that it's required and it's urgent is that we have historical clarity and honesty, right? We need to talk about that when we talk about the US's role in the world, so.
Thank you so much. The US is an empire. Robin Kelly says it. Maria de Lourdes said it. We live it, right? And it's an empire, has its own colonies, its own territories, and has tentacles throughout the world, as Sandra was saying. And this sort of clarity, I think, is crucial. Understanding the way that empire works and continues, the way that colonization continues, the way that white supremacy is preserved through colonization, through capitalism, through war. The conference here is about defending Black lives, building Black power. Confronting white supremacy requires an understanding of how it's manifested and also an obligation to the rest of the world. And so Tenji, as when I think about you firmly rooted in the place that you are, but with your hands and your heart wrapped around the entire world. I think you bring with you, wherever you are, the struggles of others etched onto your being. And there's something about you and the way you embody internationalism that I want us to think about and learn from, and that I've learned from. When I hear, Tenjiwe has said so often, this is a political commitment for me. I'm showing up. It's a political commitment, but it is because I love you. It is because I'm responsible for your joy. I've seen you do that, right? And I think part of what we wanted to do in this is, yes, the principle, the values of internationalism, but the centering of joy and the responsibility that we have to each other to ensure that we can experience joy, that we can experience healing. Part of it is knowing each other's histories and stories and heroes. I think that's right. But it's then like in that knowing, in that closeness, close enough to suffer together, close enough to preserve each other's joy, suddenly this world opens up to us. So Tenji, I would love for you to just reflect on what it means to be an internationalist. So as you were rooting yourself in kind of the history of the world, you're understanding the US as empire and ourselves as in the belly of the beast, what that opened up for you in terms of strategy, but a principle as well.
Well, I'm gonna start crying, so I'm just gonna say this now. Thank you. That was very moving. I appreciate that for me. Why I'm an internationalist? I mean, I guess I have some points, but just this piece around joy. I think what capitalism, racial hierarchies, U.S. nationalism has done, it like robs us of our, not just like our like imagination, our freedom, like what Robin Kelly talks about in terms of imagination, but the fact that we are born here to love each other, and not just like the people who look like you, but you were actually born to love each other in like really radical ways. And I think that that's part of like part of the work for me of like internationalist practice. If I'm part of a social movement in the US, I have to reject US centrism. So US centrism is one of the biggest dangers to US social movements. As I said before, nationalism, it's like deeply embedded in the fabric of American society. And if we're not careful, US centrism and nationalism will find its way within our social movement. What I mean by that is we only will talk about liberation in the context of people within the United States. And when I even said before that what we've seen throughout history is capitalist solutions are being proposed and we're being given for capitalist problems, that, and oftentimes causing suffering. Sometimes the suffering are not people that are based in the US. The suffering is to other people around the world. And so we have to reject US centrism. And the answer is internationalism. It's Pan-Africanism. It's an internationalist practice. It's an understanding that liberation is never made real if we abide by a nationalist philosophy where we're only fighting for liberation for a particular set of people in a country. Like, we have to absolutely reject that. We have to move towards away from hyper individualism, which is fed by neoliberalism that has sort of taken over the past since the 1970s and escalated, is not just about how the economy is organized, it's how we relate to each other. And so we have to reject hyper individualism and understand interdependence, and not just for folks who we live near or we fight alongside, but understand that we are deeply interdependent and need to be in deep relationship with people around the world. The other piece too is that I have found that I'm able to sharpen, that social movements are able to sharpen by studying social movements and theorists and liberators around the world. Oftentimes the idea that some of the demands or like the political thought or theory are like based in the US or come out of US theorists. Yes, we have a lot of great thinking that has come out of the history of liberation struggle in the US, but so much of it is born out of liberation struggles around the world. So we have to reject this understanding that abolition, all of these ideas, all of these like real fights are born out of the US. They're actually born out of these powerful liberation struggles that have inspired us in the US. And so it's something that we have to reject, because if we don't, it dulls us as opposed to sharpens us. What else I got? I'm sorry, y'all. I know y'all tired of me, but yeah, I mean, I think the other thing I'll just say is that the problem of racial capitalism is not a US problem. Now, a lot of racial capitalists and multinational corporations and the billionaire class have roots in the US. not just in the US. And the billionaire class has grown significantly, also made a significant amount of wealth in the trillions over the past recent years. But racial capitalism is not just a problem for the US. It is a global problem. And the only transition out of racial capitalism will take a global movement that is organized in order to move us towards transition. So when I think about what does it mean to build movement, I of course I think about what does it mean to build a Black-led, multiracial, working class movement in the US. But really what inspires me beyond that is me dreaming and thinking about a global movement of working class people around the world, held by a movement infrastructure that is led not by the North, by the way, not by the North, but is led by the leadership of social movements in the South that will help in the transition away from racial capitalism. The reason why I'm an internationalist is I feel like in my bones, it doesn't happen without it.
Thank you for that, Tenjiwe. There's so much to follow up on, and I hope that we can dig in a little bit, because there is something about this nationalism that, you know, Maria, you and I were talking about a little bit too. And there's a great Palestinian poet, I say it's Mahmoud Darwish, I think it might be someone else, who has said, though, that I am Palestinian until I'm free. Meaning that there's it's I think, rooted in the identity politics that the Combahee River Collective called us to, which is that there's something unique about your position that you need to root yourself in, but it's so that there can be greater unity, so that liberation is on the horizon. And so nationalism meaning identity, can play a particular role in understanding yourself, and then exchanging lessons across identity to see how oppression has shifted and morphed and changed so that we can build power and build unity. But there's something about that I'm interested in thinking through, because what do we do within this nation state? Because the options are not amazing. And the international options are also compromised in different ways, or could be compromised in different ways, or could be revolutionized. I think what you've taught me, Mina, is that at the international level, at the global level, at any site of power is a potential site of emancipatory struggle. I think that Mina has a view that is electric. And if you haven't had a chance to meet with Mina, also Mina will share that she's the director of the Global Network of Movement Lawyers. And so if this is speaking to you, talk to Mina, because Mina's organizing and is organizing in this way, is building power in the way that Tenjiwe is instructing us to build power. And I think you see possibility wherever you go. I think you're an artist, you're a creative, you see possibility, but you have a lot of analysis about these two kind of threads of the international work. One reinforces the sort of neoliberal internationalism that we're talking about and was meant to preserve that, actually. And the other, which is where we're going to move in this next fishbowl exercise too, and is this sort of radical globalism, radical internationalism that has within it the possibility of a new world. So I want, if you can, to kind of talk us through those two threads of how internationalism can be manifested and the way that you're pushing us towards kind of radical global internationalism.
Thank you. Nadia's going to make me cry too. Yeah, I mean, you know, I was actually really reflecting on the talk from this morning and Rob and DG Kelly's points about liberalism, because, you know, in the international system and the multilateral institutions as they exist right now are manifestations of liberalism. Literally, colonialism is written into the institutions of multilateralism, because at the time that, you know, the Bretton Woods institutions were being created, and even while the UN was being created, still much of the world was still suffering under colonialism. And so those institutions led by ex-colonial powers and actually present colonial powers at that time and the US did not want those institutions to actually be ones that would provide a path to liberation or independence of what is now known as the Global South. And so part of, I think, what we need to think about, especially as we think about, what we do as lawyers, is one, how do you use these institutions that currently exist for counter-hegemonic ends, but then also this unfinished business of decolonization actually requires that we transform or perhaps abolish these institutions that were actually created to preserve a neoliberal agenda. There's this great book, actually, it's called The Globalist. I talk about it a lot. It talks about actually the Geneva School of neoliberalism. And at that time, they actually, it's not the sort of view of neoliberalism that we often think about in the US, which is like small state. In fact, they thought of these institutions or thought of neoliberalism as a way to insulate markets, to create a global system, a neoliberal globalist system that insulates markets from democracy and that would insulate markets from newly independent states. And what that means is that currently the institutions that are structuring our global economic system are not actually there to, they're actually complicit in ongoing neocolonial structures, extractivism, ongoing colonialism in much of the Global South, which prevents self-determination and prevents many of these countries from actually implementing the political visions that the people are asking for, and that they basically the kind of the detachment from the capitalist system that many people from, it's very clear from Global South struggles that they are trying to fight against the idea of, divestment from services, a lack of public education, a lack of public health institutions. And so for me, I think part of what motivates me in terms of doing this international work is that we cannot arrive at decolonization. We cannot arrive at ending imperialism unless we actually address the sort of legal roots of the global international system and the global economic system. And so part of, I think, what Nadia was mentioning is that with the Global Network of Movement Lawyers, or just generally this project of building solidarity across borders, is how do we understand the struggles that we are engaging in locally as part of a much bigger picture. And I think when we talk about internationalism, we're not necessarily saying everybody must work at the international level, but you need to understand how what it is that you're doing is locally is how it is connected to the international. And when we do that, we can be more strategic. Because, for example, like I always talk about this one story I worked in Miami for a long time. And one of the groups I worked with was the Dream Defenders. And I think it was 2016 or so, one of the main targets was GEO, which is a private prison company. And one of the questions that we were looking at the time was GEO as a divestment, as a target for divestment. And it was interesting because, like, once we started looking at the numbers and then, where all GEO was getting its money from, I mean, first we were like, okay, Miami is a drop in the bucket, Florida is a drop in the bucket. But then, like, even if all of the US divested, I mean, they were already beginning to export private prisons to Brazil and many other places. And so when you start to think about it that way, like, even though, yes, it's important to close a private prison locally, you also need to understand that those companies are have their tentacles everywhere. And we actually, in order to, as Tenji was saying, like if we are seeking liberation, we can't just seek it within any borders. We actually need to be strategic and work together with movements elsewhere to actually hit at these targets. So to me, internationalism is anti-capitalist. It is a moral imperative, but it is also strategic. And as you were saying, in terms of being inspired by freedom dreams of our siblings around the world, to me, it's the pathway to a new future.
So we want to move into this fishbowl in about 10 minutes, but I want to, and in there, we're going to ask you all to also surface some of the threats and opportunities that you're seeing. Mina's going to facilitate this and we'll clarify a little bit about, how does, I'm going to pull up something that we are in Ferguson, which is where I think actually Bandung became very clear to me, which is one of the most brilliant organizers and artists, Tara T, who said, reflecting on kind of this solidarity, said, what united us across struggles was a recognition that we were being killed by the same forces. Because the empire is operating in the same way against all of our communities, we needed to come together to share resistance strategies and to imagine a very different future. So Tara was on a delegation to Palestine, is from Ferguson, and there was this moment in 2015, but this is how she started understanding these shared threats and, what are the roots and structures and systems. And then if you can see it, then you can start parsing out the vulnerabilities and start really being strategic about how you organize. Before we go into the fishbowl, I think I would just love for each of you, if there's something that you want to respond to of each other, or a value that animates the work that hasn't been articulated yet. So we've talked about anti-capitalism, we've talked about Black feminism, we've talked about abolition, and these ideas of like the kinds of values that animate this new world. If you want to talk about that, so if something hasn't been surfaced yet, or a moment of international solidarity that you just want to reflect on, that has and had some sort of shift in relationships and conditions that you would want to celebrate, so that we have it in the room as we go into the next part. So, sorry.
Yeah. So I do want to mention that, at least in the case of Puerto Rico, I think that the very real sequence of disasters that happened like from 2016 with the austerity crisis on the island and the Promesa, the fiscal control board imposition, that like through Congress, there's a bill that President Obama signed in effect, just like imposed a fiscal control board on the island to control the island's finances, et cetera. We can talk about this later over coffee if you want. But the sequence of disasters just like made it very, gave people, I believe, a lot of context as to like how this is simply just an example of that's happening just because of the time we're living today. And it kind of made people more curious and more intrigued as to like what has happened in the past. We studied, we talked to people, we talked to our parents, our grandparents, we read, we were constantly just looking for more ways to like dig our ways out of that hole, right? At least, I don't know where I was going with this. Oh, but after the Promesa and after Hurricane Maria, right? To me, the best example of like how that actually took a very real effect and had some really real results was in the 2020 elections, because it is a very pertinent way for you to see like how people are changing their mindsets and are like becoming more politically aware and are becoming more politically conscious. And this was a huge deal for Puerto Ricans because in a matter of a quatrenio, of a term, a 4-year term, the PNP party, the statehood party, had lost over 1 million votes. That is huge. That is a third of the Puerto Rican population. And that to me was over the span of like 4 years. That's it. That's all it took for people to be like, wait, this is not what we want. And it sparked a very real global a conversation with people that have been going through from other, not just like US jurisdiction, but other countries as well, that just like included, and Puerto Rico was used as a model for how, these and disasters and austerity, not just take lives, but they push, I think that it was, hello? I think it was Dr. Jamala Rogers that said that St. Lucians have been taking slow burns slowly, right, through the course of time, but that it eventually sparked anger and sparked resistance and sparked right action. And that's exactly what happened in Puerto Rico. And we didn't do it alone. We had many models across the world to see, right, to visualize what change could look like. And I think that we're not where we want to be right now, but I think we're much closer.
A lot is on my mind. I keep going back to Tenji and Dr. Kelly this morning, and the idea that winning doesn't equate to building power. And I'm just thinking about all the times that we lost. But the relationships that we built along the way, the trust we built, how important all of that is for the next battle. I mean, Tenji gave so much time to the Palestine movement. I called her out of the blue and I said, I have a 4-day conference. I need you to facilitate a bunch of Palestinians who don't agree on anything. And she was like, yeah, sure. Why not? I'll come, I'll do that. And she just poured her heart into it. And just the trust and the relationships that we were able to build through her gentle nurturing are things that, we still rely on today, those relationships. And then whenever I see a target, Geo was a big target back in the day. Now we're thinking about cultural wins. Recently, we launched a campaign against Sierra Club because Sierra Club was taking nature outings, bird watching trips to apartheid Israel. The descriptions of the trips didn't mention anything about Palestine or Palestinians. They referred to parts of the West Bank and the Golan Strip as parts of Israel. And I was like, yeah, that's not going to happen. And so I said, well, how do I get Sierra Club to listen to me? And I was like, they're going to pay attention when I bring into coalition, Movement for Black Lives, when I bring into coalition Indian Collective, because they claim to be an organization that upholds Black lives. They claim to be an organization that wants to seek Indigenous justice. And they saw that list of organizations and they were like, when can we meet? And they listened very carefully. And actually there was a subset of the leadership that was like, yeah, we're canceling these trips. That was wrong. We're really sorry. They backtracked because they got a lot of pressure from funders and leadership. But just, even though we didn't quite win, like I'm so excited about the next fight because of that love and those relationships.
Thanks, Sandra. I like some other notes to say, but then I'll try to be short. Sorry. I guess the first thing that came to mind is like this, the significance of Black Palestinian solidarity, like for a number of reasons. But I think a lot of us know, particularly in organizing in U.S. social movements, what was often popular and unsaid is everybody but Palestinians. Everything but Palestine. And it was a way in which Zionism was so entrenched within left social politics and social movements that it actually, Black liberation needed to take a position around anti-Zionism and be in solidarity with Palestinians. And so just wanted to speak to that, and also to say that I've learned so much. Like Palestinian liberation struggles have, as a student of it, and someone has taught me so much about liberation. And so just so much gratitude for just the fight and the resistance. The one thing that's come up, because we often talk about racial capitalism and anti-Blackness, we don't, and I just want to bring to the fore patriarchy, particularly patriarchal domination, as a key feature in maintaining global world order. And so like we have to talk about anti-Blackness and white supremacy, racial capitalism as like obviously what is sort of dictating how the world is organized, but patriarchal domination and violence, meaning nations being the most powerful, having control, power over, is a core feature. It's not just affecting us in our interpersonal lives, it's affecting us at the meta level in terms of how governments are operating. And so when we talk about war, we talk about NATO, what we also have to understand is like there is a fight over the global world order. There is a fight as who's going to maintain power within the world. That at the core of it is racial, is a product of racial capitalism, is a product of anti-Blackness, but it's also a product of patriarchal domination. And so we have to like understand that and reject it. Sure, I had some other stuff to say, but sometimes I begin like just in my own head around stuff. Yeah, can I stop there? Okay.
Thank you all so much. We hope that there's, Maria, you talked about political clarity, that there's some coming to consensus, common understanding of shared struggle, common understanding of the enemy, of oppression, right? And why that matters. As Tara said, and Tara, I referenced you right as you walked in. The empire is coordinated. The opposition is coordinated. The opposition has generational plans, and those are global. Capitalism has no borders. Patriarchal domination, thank you for bringing that into the room. That is the world order. Without borders, right? And I think part of what we are proposing and offering and insisting upon is that when we really recognize that we have what we need, that we are the multitude, suddenly we start seeing the shared systems, and there's not so many. Angela Davis says, go to the root. To be radical is to just go to the root, go to the root, go to the root. And when you keep asking, why, there's only a few reasons why. And that should encourage us, that should inspire us for the battles ahead. We're going to move into the fishbowl, but we're going to do a modified fishbowl a bit. And Mina, you're going to walk us through this, because part of it is just surfacing additional threats, listening to it, hearing it in the room, and hearing who's speaking it, because these are your people. If you look around, remember the people who are in this room. They will carry you through the struggles ahead. Tara, I'm looking at you again, because how many struggles have you carried me through? These are your people. And when the state and the courts suspend your rights, take away your humanity, the people here will give it back to you. It never left the people here. They see your humanity. They do not believe in the hierarchy of human life. They see your humanity. They give you rights, and your rights are located here. And if your rights are located here, your power is located here. And that's what Tenjiwa was calling us to do. And so this is the moment to listen to each other and to find each other. Just look around. Look around, find each other. So listen as we're speaking, and I'll let Mina for the next half hour move us into this conversation.
Sure. Thank you. The one thing that I'll just add to that discussion, I won't spend a lot of time, is just that building solidarity is slow. It's slow work. It's work. It's not something that you get from just a delegation. A delegation is a starting point, but really the basis of solidarity is love, right? And it is a real understanding that our struggles are intertwined, and I don't need to be experiencing your suffering in order for me to fight alongside you, you know? And so that's kind of what it is that we want to lean into on this long project of building solidarity. It is a multi-decade, it's long arc work. And that's part of what we're trying to do today with this conversation. So I see lots of people. There's Tara, there's Nomzamo, there's Dimitri, there's Alexis. There's so many people in here who do their work with an internationalist lens, Vince, or those who are maybe curious about it. So what we wanted to do, it's going to be kind of usually within a fishbowl, like it's a circle, you have the 4 chairs, people sit in the chair. I think what we're going to do instead, just with the way the room is set up, is I'm going to give this mic to whoever wants to step into this kind of fishbowl space. And then others who may want to make a comment, it would be great if you want to sit over here on deck so that you can just jump in to the fishbowl. And basically, the question that we're asking is, what are the threats that you see on the horizon? And also, what are the opportunities for international solidarity, international movement building? But oftentimes fishbowls can also be a place where you pose another question, and then perhaps there's someone else in the audience who can offer some wisdom on that point. So we're gonna, see how it goes. We'll let the people decide how they want to use this space. I know I'm gravitating over here towards Nomzamo, but someone else can take the mic if you feel so moved.
So hi, everyone. So thank you so much for that. Marie-Louise, listening to you, I could just relate to the South African history and being in this exact moment. But one of the things that we're struggling with right now is apophobia. So South Africa is ablaze because of apophobia. So whereas everyone is welcome, in fact, with speaking with CCR last night, they were saying we had to go to South Africa in a week's time. Some of us didn't need visas. But if you're coming from Lesotho, if you're coming from Zimbabwe, if you're coming from Mozambique, you need a visa to come into South Africa. And you're mostly all the time unwelcome. And it's a question to the panel of like, how do we respond in a way that addresses that? The fact that people who are like us are unwelcome everywhere in the world, and they're also unwelcome in the place that they should belong in.
Like Nomzamo, I'm from South Africa, but I call St. Louis home. And my challenge to you all would be that African Americans have paved the way for many of us to be here, and they have struggled significantly since slavery to date. So as responsible citizens of the world, and I speak as a South African cognizant of the fact that we fully support the Palestinian struggle, but how do we internationalize our understanding when we live somewhere to say, if we as Palestinians own all the gas stations and convenience stores in Black areas, why aren't we treating African Americans as human beings? I came from South Africa to the city in 1984 to study as first student as part of the divestment program. And I was adopted by Jamala Rogers, whom you heard from yesterday, and the Organization for Black Struggle in this city. Today, I'm working with the Organization for Black Struggle through funding from the White House to the city of St. Louis, you heard our mayor yesterday, to deal with the crisis in our city regarding violence in a community, and this is targeted towards males, mostly 15 to 25. So my challenge to you guys, I'm a little older than most of you in this room. I've been through it all. I've been a director at the International Red Cross in Switzerland, Geneva. We are, and we should be anti-capitalist. We should be anti-establishment. We should be united in solidarity. St. Louis, mind you, for all its difficulties, gave the anti-apartheid struggle huge support. But my challenge to you guys is you have the skills, you understand the systems, you know how the world works. You should conduct, we should conduct parallel struggles. So while we fight the system, in my opinion, we should infiltrate the system too. Because what concerned me this week with my humanitarian hat was the United Nations Security Council fighting over whether food aid can go to northwestern Syria because Russia was blocking aid. So we know the UN Security Council needs reform. We know it's dominated by Western powers and Russia and China fighting each other. But the bulk of our people that were once in the non-aligned movement coming out of the conference in Indonesia are excluded from big decisions. So in terms of international solidarity, we need to open more doors and find better ways to fight. And therefore, I challenge you, you in this room, you need to be the next Cory Bushes too. We need to fight the struggle on multiple areas. You need to be sitting in the UN Security Council. You need to be sitting at some of these institutions. So we make a difference, not just for Americans and Puerto Rico, which remains largely ignored, but for the millions and billions of people who are hungry today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Parallel struggles. We have to use, tactically use the institutions even as we transform or dismantle them and build something new. Who else would like to step in? Okay, we'll go to Kelsey and then.
Hi, is it okay if I step back here? Great. Hi, I'm Kelsey. My pronouns are she, her. It's wonderful to hear you all. I'm so blown away by, I love that the framework today was the people of Palestine and the people of Puerto Rico, because the connections are just profound. And where I've been reflecting and listening to you all is that, the violence against the people of Palestine is so blatant and explicit and obvious, and still it's we're told this lie that, it's deserved in some way. History is rewritten, and we're told that, that there's terrorist action that makes it warranted and deserved. And then in Puerto Rico, Maria, you mentioned promesa, and there's this lie about the debt and the people's obligation to repay that debt that they didn't benefit from at all, right? And it also brought, you mentioned the myth, and it's just classic US gaslighting behavior, right? That that, the violence against the Palestinian people is so blatant and so obvious, and still we're told to justify it. And then the US behavior is thinly veiled violence through eviction and through, just this disgusting, influx of investment in needed land. And so it's, the connection is obvious. And so the threat that comes to mind is just the pacification of, the US's tendency to do it in this very thinly veiled way that allows people to remain willfully blind, which is what generally people, remain comfortable. And I guess the opportunity, which this is obvious and not profound, is just drawing that connection that in both of those situations, we're told, people can see what's happening, but we're told that it's deserved, right? We're told this lie that it's deserved. And so that just occurred to me. Thanks.
Hey, everybody. Hello, there you go. My name is Victor Onsang, he, him, his, from Miami, Florida. I've been following Mina around for like 7 years, trying to pick up the little gems. I just wanted to talk about being from Miami. I feel like I'm somebody that likes to point the finger at people and say like, hey, that's my enemy. And I feel like we need to have some clear like description of like where should we point some of these antagonisms. And in the same vein, I think it is an opportunity to find solidarity with some of the socialist projects around the world, right? In Miami, Florida, there's a lot of reactionary forces that are always kind of fleeing to their $500,000 homes, right? They're exiled in $500,000 homes in the gentrified areas of Miami, in the Miami suburbs. But I do feel that some of the threats are that these people do get a nice platform or a lot of attention, even from some people at this very conference or some of the organizations that we all work with. we give them the mic and let them say that these projects, these socialist projects that are being built in Latin America are evil, or kind of emphasize some of the bad things that do happen, right? Trying to kind of protect themselves from U.S. imperialism, and I do feel like so when we're speaking about internationalism, we have to kind of highlight that it is anti-imperialist work. So yeah, I just want to hear a little bit more about how to deal with kind of those contradictions, right? Of people who come here and sometimes are in these progressive spaces and trying to do good work, but have a really reactionary stance towards their parents' countries or their countries.
I want to give that to someone to respond. Okay. Sorry. Hey, everybody. Dimitri is my name. My pronouns are he, him. I'm unfortunately don't want to respond to that, but I think it's an important question. I guess I wanted to just make one point, building off of something that Tenjue said, and actually from this morning's session about the way in which internationalism can help kind of sharpen our strategy and sharpen our movements. You know, I wanted so one, we had a session this morning that spoke about the importance of kind of history and understanding our history in order to both locate our current struggles in that and inform how we move forward. And I want to make the point about how internationalism itself can also, in certain instances, or the praxis of that, can also be a potential scope into the future, right? And to give an example of this, so I'm from South Africa, as I mentioned yesterday. I was doing education justice organizing, specifically youth organizing, in building a national youth movement to advance the right to education as contained in our constitution. And we were quite successful in mobilizing young people across the country in a way that was actually challenging power and challenging our own, you know, post-apartheid Black-led government that was still not doing enough to advance the education of many Black young people across the country. And there was this interesting thing that happened, that as we were building this movement, suddenly next to us, both figuratively and literally, we found allies that were agreeing with us that the public education system was failing Black people, that it needed to be more equitable and better resourced. And then we had these solutions that were basically neoliberal privatization agendas, right? So in aligning themselves with us, but with a different agenda to undermine the role of the state, in this instance, in providing education, had we not in the movement been looking at how education justice fights had been happening in the United States, we may not actually have seen that we would be helping to, you know, create the wedge for a larger privatization agenda. I'm talking about Teach for America, was showing up as Teach for Africa when we were fighting every day to show the statistics of how there was a teacher shortage in rural and township schools. And here seems like a solution to this: young people, students coming to teach and fill this gap. That was part of a much longer privatization agenda that, had we not looked at the United States, in other words, seen a potential future, we might very well have actually been, fighting for the wrong side, so to speak. So that's one piece that I want to say, is from kind of South Africa to the US. I made this point yesterday, but wasn't able to elaborate on it. I would say that there's also, at least from South Africa to the United States now, important potential lessons to look at when thinking about the question of democracy. Because every other day in the United States, I hear about how we are needing to build, this democracy is not working and we need to build towards a multiracial democracy. And it stops there in a way that I'm like, democracy, even actually adding multiracial to it is the new kind of buzzword. And I laugh because I'm like, firstly, it's the flaw. But if you want to look at a democracy actually that has a powerful constitution, that has a Black government, that is multiracial, and yet inequality is still increasing under those conditions, that we early on in the United States need to be talking about much more than a multiracial democracy, because once we get there and see that, oh shit, this is not actually going to do it for us, it might just be too late, to kind of adapt our strategies. Anyway, sorry for the long-winded piece of it, but just want to, again, both looking at the past and the potential of the future through internationalism feels very important to me.
Hi, my name is Ayla, she, her pronouns. I have more of a question than a reflection. I'm just, as someone who's a little bit younger, who's a student of global movement lawyering, and I'm still continuing to absorb all of the brilliance that so many folks who've been doing this work for so long are bringing into this space. I'm still trying to understand what the role of global institutions such as that we consider sort of like the global state, like the ICC, like the UN, and places that, we often are trying to bring about these rights to people across the globe. But those are sites that were never created as areas for liberation. And so what does it mean to, as we're thinking about building power outside of the courtroom in the US, what does that mean at the global stage? And I guess the second part of that question is when we think about multicultural, multiracial solidarity around the world, I think recognizing the real intersections that folks live at and how that sometimes creates conflict within the work. For example, like anti-Blackness continues to pervade the globe in oppressed communities just as much as white communities in some ways. And so how do we think about building those solidarity networks while also recognizing the work that we have to do within?
Hi, everyone. My name is Alexis, she, her pronouns. I had a little bit of a similar question as Ayla or Ava? Ayla, in terms of when we want to root ourselves and engage in other countries, whether that's the country of our ancestors, how are we able to do that without relying on the NGO structure and the UN in order to get there? And that for me, this comes from a place of my family being from Ghana and me having the long-term goal of connecting the diaspora through being able to be connected in Louisiana, where I am now, in the United States generally, and in Ghana, as well as a couple of other places. And knowing that when I am able to go to Ghana, it's within this very privileged context, and that privileged context providing me also access to people who are, and this is kind of like a threat, there was a question in the threat that I had, and people who are either Black or people of color who are trying to escape the United States and then bring neoliberal ideas to these other countries, and then claiming that it's their freedom because now they have power and access and privilege in these places, and just like completely ignoring the fact that they are still Americans in this place, and they are colonizing these places that they say that they're calling home. And it becomes difficult because I've had a lot of arguments with Americans or expats who are like, there's a lot of opportunity. And what the subtext of that I'm hearing is there's a lot of opportunity for me to be the oppressor. And so, and for me, like my lands have been colonized, and the a very important ancestral spiritual body of water has been polluted and mined because, a lot of expats or other people want to have lakeside homes and want to have peace, but in their peace, they're creating a lot of violence. to the the villages and things that are there. I do see it as an opportunity to start help, through these conversations, getting people to understand that they are now in the position that they were fleeing, and figuring out how to re-engage and start to interact in a more meaningful way with the community that's there, and also helping the community to understand that just because I'm an American doesn't mean that you should hold me on any kind of pedestal. I'm now here with you, and yes, I am Ghanaian, but I grew up in the United States. I speak very minimal Tree. Like, I am learning from you. I am learning how to engage in my homeland from you, and I want to be in relationship with you in this particular way. And that does take a lot of time, but I do think that it's an opportunity, especially as there's more conversations about escaping the United States, even though if you're fleeing the United States, you're still going to be encountering the United States' colonial project wherever you go in the world.
Hi, my name is Ashley. I just wanted to talk more about the opportunities as Puerto Ricans. I think that USS has done a great job trying to separate Puerto Ricans from our Caribbean, from the Latinos, even from the Black communities. So when we heard and when we had the promesa come on and say you have to pay this huge debt with your money, and when the disasters came on and say like, oh, you have to wait for the aid from the states, I think that that was a great opportunity for us to unite as a country and to go back to the communities and say like, we can do this for ourselves, to look around and look at other countries in the Caribbean, in South America, like Chile, like Mexico, and look at them and say like, USA is not gonna save us. They never care about us. Like, we have to, so we started to connect with those communities so we can, and now I think that for Puerto Rico, we're saying like, hell no, we deserve better. We don't deserve to pay this debt. We don't deserve a president that comes to our country in disaster and throw paper towels at us. So I think that our mind now is changing because of this disaster that's happening, and we are seeing new opportunities to put our bodies in the fight and not feel alone. So we can feel, and we feel like we have a community of people that are with us.
Okay. Hi, my name is Diala Shammas. I go by she, her. And I, for the purpose of situating myself, am Palestinian, came to the US as an adult and as a lawyer, or to learn law and stay in practice. So I've been thinking a lot about this question of, and Tenji put it really well, the way that US centrism makes its way into our social movements. Both, I think, she was referring to how that happens, in US social movements, but I've been thinking a lot about how it's also something that we in the way that I've seen, and this is directly related to what Alexis was saying and what Ayla was asking, not just, NGOization that's happening in our countries, but also in how the language and the language that's sort of developed and popularized gets, and then essentially then is used to be able to fundraise with and be able to kind of get traction on social media and so on, is like, it is being clung to by folks. I'm so in Palestine, that's absolutely something. And just a very recent example, I was on a call with a group of Palestinian Americans who are in Palestine, who are trying to take advantage of the Biden administration's visit and to raise a whole range of really important issues around, US direct support for apartheid. But they were using the language of equal protection because that was, that was like what they thought could go viral, or that was what was going to get traction. Similarly, we have projects about thinking through, the deep origins, the US origins of the colonial project of Israel, including through how we've exported private, through how the let's say, private action from the US and from the metropole in Europe and in the US is basically, what sort of has funded and and originated the Zionist movements through forms of charities. And then the language of defund and racism is like what's really being what people are like resonating with and running with, you know, primarily on social media. So I've been thinking a lot about how that's a threat. It's also in many ways an opportunity. But it does oftentimes feel like we have a really hard time moving past the deeper, so sorry, this is all over the place. The opportunity is there's a lot more of these moments and exchanges and this sort of shared language and shared analysis. That's, I think, easier to do through social media. And then a challenge with it is like, how do we move past that? And I think we all are, I think there's a lot of like shared analysis even in this room. There's a more of a dearth of examples of how it can be done in a deeper way, in an institutional way, how we can think of moments like Bandung and not just like celebrate them, but also reflect on the contradictions there. And how we, you know, how we also overcome the challenges that I think everybody here has talked about in terms of just how do you do base building internationally with not just the physical obstacles and the visas, but also the way to not just talk about shared roots in an analysis form, but what is like praxis of this look like? And I guess wanted to invite folks who've been thinking a lot about this, building networks around this, like what some of those concrete ideas look like, alternatives to the ICC, alternatives to the UN, and also what even campaigns might look like that kind of go deeper than just naming things, and then hoping that simply naming the parallels, you know, can get us somewhere.
Well, I have lots of thoughts on that, but we are actually at the end of our time, but I have one comment here, and then one thing that I have always loved and think gives us the joy that we need as we continue in this hard work is chants, song, you know, a way to bring to actually embody what it is to struggle with people from other places and literally chant the things that their movements are chanting. So we wanted to have a little bit of space at the end of this to do that. So I'm gonna go here and here, and then we'll end with Tara, and then we'll do a chant or two and end.
Thank you. I'll keep this short. My name is Sahil Singhvi. I use he, him pronouns. I'm a law student and very young in this space, so feel very blessed to be able to listen to all of you speak about all of these things. One thing that came up yesterday in our small groups when we were talking, Matt Glover brought up the concept of dual power, which was really resonating with me when I was listening to Dimitri speak yesterday. And I think this is both a threat and a question, which is to say, like, how do we practice dual power when there seem to be so many things to resist? How do we both take urgency toward envisioning and building joy and positivity and possible futures, while we have to do the hard work of resisting as well? And what are the mechanisms of change for us to be able to do that? But I could hear the rest of y'all speak about that, but yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Hey, peace, y'all. I'm Tara. I have a whole lot of challenges for us and not a whole lot of solutions. So maybe we'll come up with some while we're chanting or something. I want to challenge us to, I was listening to this young lady back here talk about how they paint the picture of deserving. And I want to challenge us to just move past like some of that real base level stuff, right? We're past that. The US lies. We know that. You know that in every facet of your life, from whatever your local department is, all the way up to Palestine, to many global situations, right? So I want us to move past spending energy on like stuff that we don't even have to spend energy on that anymore. Like the US lies, people don't deserve to be bombed in their homes. Like, let's move on. And I think that if we can move to a place where we start to categorize all violence, like stop with the precursors, like the what's democracy now, multiracial, like they throw these precursors on the word, right, to change the meaning of it. There is no thinly veiled violence. Violence is violence. We're in an abusive relationship, and it might start small, like you see all these people on the corner looking for change because they're unhoused. That only escalates to bombing you in your home to take your land, right? So if you think about how many things in your life are tied to your housing and your housing being stable, that dictates where you go to get education, that dictates where and what kind of food you eat, that dictates where your parents can work, which dictates on some level the quality of your life. That dictates how many trees are outside your house, what your allergies gonna hit for, all of those things. So if I destabilize your housing, I can do whatever I want with you. So I challenge us to move past. We already know all this shit. We know the US is violent. We know they'll do whatever they will do. We know that imperialism exists. We know all of these things. So let's just like ramp it up. Like whatever ramp it up looks like, let's just go to the next thing. Because we don't have to waste time on that, and we don't have time to waste on that. So that's all I got.
Okay, hello. My name is Felipe. I'm from Argentina. And briefly, like, I think that most of the threats, at least for Latin America, had to do with this tandem that has been very exported from the USA, that has to do with fascism and neoliberalism as a tandem that is growing. I mean, probably they haven't won the elections now in Colombia, but they are the second force. I mean, they are present, they are winning power, the system is prepared for them. I mean, so it's not, it's not prepared for Petro, but prepared for for Hernandez and for the fascism. So also cast in Chile, in Argentina, after the end of the dictatorship. I mean, we dismantled the dictatorship and we didn't have such a far right an extremist party that now we are having, I mean, after 2016. So, and they are producing genocides now because Bolsonaro is a genocide. Janina Áñez in Bolivia has done a genocide, but they are also trying to produce epistemicides. So the way we reach our knowledge, the way we build not just our reality, but also our legal systems, because, and that's how neoliberalism has a lot in common with fascism in our land, because we are not used to, we don't have a culture, because we have a struggle not to have private education, private health. That's not our history. And they are struggling for commodification, for neoliberalization of all those rights that we have already won. So I think that, I mean, that's the biggest threat, I think, that is increasing, but the opportunities have to do with, I mean, those social movements that at least in the global South, we are discussing the state. We are discussing the state and the participation in the state. I don't know if here you are like, this is how social movements are, like, that's the strategy, but I think that it's interesting to see how social movements can get in, can take the power in that idea of dual power as well. So that's it.
Thank you, Felipe. I think, we could probably spend the whole day on this, but there's many more. There's lunch on the other side. So, I mean, there's a lot of, contradictions that we talked about. I think that, in terms of solutions, folks have talked about common targets, have talked about, really trying to use the tools that we have to build a better analysis and a deeper analysis. So not just keep it in superficial, sort of terms on top, but actually really try to understand the specific ways that the people and the entities that are perpetrating this violence are interrelated. So, I don't know if my other panelists have any other final words or if we want to end here. I'm looking at Nomzamo again for because she is an amazing chant leader, but someone else may want to bring a chant in, or perhaps if you do not want to do it, okay, well then someone else. Who has a chant for us? Seems like Nomzamo is electing Dimitri as her proxy.
So, like, any easy chance? So there is one chant. If people who know South Africa, they'll know, which is from women, which says, "Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa." Right? Which means you touch women, you touch a brick, you're gonna die. So, can we manage it? Can we? Eh? Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. We can try. And Dee is here and Razia is here. Between the three of us, we're gonna try and carry everyone and then you'll join. Right? Okay, I'll go. Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. Right? So we must do it together. Or what we can do, I'll go wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. And then like that, like that, like that. Right?
One more time, one more time.
2 more practices.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. Are we good now?
Yeah.
Okay. Wathinta abafazi. Okay, one more practice and then we will definitely go and then we can go to lunch.
Yeah, yeah.
Wathinta abafazi, wathinta imbokodo, uzofa. Wathinta abafazi. Come on, nigga. Okay. D, come. Come with the other mic. So let's just do it between the two of us for like,
Yeah.
like 3 tries, and then everybody will get into the rhythm.
What? Oh, wathinta abafazi,
Wathinta imbokodo,
uzofa.
wathinta abafazi,
Wathinta imbokodo,
uzofa.
wathinta abafazi,
Wathinta imbokodo,
uzofa. Okay.
wathinta abafazi,
Wathinta imbokodo,
uzofa.
fa.